Well, good morning. I wouldn't call a peace plan. In fact, it's not a peace plan. It's a position paper. It's a paper where China has put together all their positions expressed since the beginning. I don't want to dismiss it at all. It has interesting considerations about the use of nuclear arms, exchange of prisoners, the grain. I was saying that I want to dismiss it because it has interesting considerations in which one can agree. But in order to be a plan, it should be operationalized. I mean, a plan is not a set of considerations. It's something that you can implement, and how to implement. Certainly, everybody could agree on the need to stop fighting, but under which control and how. So I wouldn't call it a peace plan, but a position paper. And from my point of view, in order to be credible, China should go also to Kiev. When the president of Senegal or the president of Indonesia presented proposals, they went both to Moscow and Kiev. So my advice would be to the Chinese, if they want to be credible and not be considered one-sided, they should go to Kiev also and to talk with President Kuleba, as they did with President Putin, in order to present both points of view. And secondly, they cannot put on the same ground the aggressor and the aggressed. This is the first point. And here at the United Nations, an overwhelming majority of member states clearly asked for the withdrawal of Russian troops, for the cessation of hostilities, and for the respect of the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So let's see now what the Chinese representative will explain us about it. But I want to stress that it is not a peace plan, it is a position paper that deserves to be considered, and in order to be credible, it should be shared with both parts.
But are there any points in it that you could find some common ground on to begin finding some sort of real peace plan?
Certainly, there are interesting points. As I said, nuclear safety of nuclear stations, not use of nuclear weapons, exchange of prisoners, grain deals. But in order to talk about ceasefire or stop hostilities, one has to be operational. And to put both parts in the same ground is not the right way to talk about it.
Okay. Sure. Ladies and gentlemen, very good morning. Exactly.
Raise the mic. Sorry, we're having a problem hearing you. Just raise it up. Thank you.
Better.
Hopefully.
We meet today exactly a year after Russia started its war, unjustified, unprovoked war against its neighbor, Ukraine. A year ago, many of us have wondered whether Kiev will stand, whether Ukraine will stand. All of those who doubted have been proven wrong. Today we have to make it very clear that we have no doubts that Ukraine can win this war. Yesterday there was a vote in the United Nations General Assembly asking for a just peace for Ukraine. And I can tell you there can be no just peace without a victory. There can be no justice without victory, as we cannot trust that Russia will hold to the peace if there is no victory for Ukraine. When it comes to the proposal made by China, so-called a peace plan, I think that we have to be very cautious. On one hand, the plan speaks about the respect for sovereignty. On the other hand, it alludes that the country cannot choose its security. It cannot choose the alliances that it needs to take. And it cannot choose to stay sovereign and with full territorial integrity. Therefore, I would not consider that a peace plan. I would consider that as something of a proposal for a new world order, even, where the might is right. I think we need to stick to the plan where right is right. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, also very good morning. And exactly a year ago, I was in Kiev when the war started. I saw with my own eyes that Ukrainians were ready to fight despite what the experts, what the world was thinking at that point. And a year later, we are in a situation where Ukraine is still fighting. I think that the only way that we can get to the lasting peace is helping Ukraine in any way we can. I think that the next step after yesterday's vote in General Assembly is the need to prepare for accountability vote, for vote on special tribunal on the crime of aggression, and that is something that Latvia is going also to work very hard. Gabrielis already alluded to the 12-point Chinese plan. Let me just say that it is good that China is finally stepping up and working out some kind of proposals. But what I also believe that just peace and the international order can be restored only based on the principles of UN Charter. The Russian troops need to get out of Ukraine, and only then we can start speaking about the just peace. I consider the Chinese proposal as the right step forward when it comes to the greater involvement, but I do consider that it's not reaching far enough when it comes to restoration of territorial integrity. And as Lithuanian Foreign Minister said, the only way how we can proceed is if we are sticking to international law, that we are not trying to compromise in any way with the basic principles of UN charters. And that is something that I see lacking in this 12-point proposal.
Every plan, peace plan, which takes not as a precondition a full territorial integrity of Ukraine, a full liberation of Ukrainian territory, is a false plan. Estonia full-heartedly supports President Zelensky's 10-point peace plan. This should be elaborated. And all world people should help Ukraine, should help victim state by giving all the power it needs to self-defense based on UN Charter. And this war has, to the future of world relations, to the world security architecture, a strategical importance. All the Baltic countries have recognized this aggression war as a genocidal act, and I call all the nations on earth to follow this path. This is a genocide having intent to annihilate a European nation and statehood. There should be accountability, and General Assembly should give a mandate to establish a particular tribunal on Russian Federation aggression crime against Ukraine, and Putin should be under that tribunal with his nearest accomplices and not hide under the coverage of immunity. Thank you.
The 9,269th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a statement. I give them the floor.
Господин председатель,
Mr. President,
хотел бы сказать
I would
несколько
like
слов
to
по порядку
just say a few
ведения
words
заседания.
regarding a point of order.
Хотели бы попросить
We
вас
would like to
пояснить,
ask you to please clarify
на каком основании
what
вы
is
предлагаете дать министру иностранных
basis
дел
you
Украины
are
Дмитрию Кулебе
proposing to give the floor to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine and to give them the floor before members of the Council speak.
Мы не имеем ничего против
We
его
have
выступления,
nothing against his statement,
но в Совете существуют
but the Council
правила,
has its rules
которые были установлены
which
задолго до
were
того, как
established
Мальта стала
long
членом Совета
before
Безопасности.
Malta became president in the Security Council,
Стала членом Совета
became a
Безопасности.
member rather of
вы,
the
господин
Security
председатель,
Council, and
должны
me,
внести.
you,
Я хотел получить бы ответ на этот вопрос.
Mr. President, could at least provide me with the answer to my question. Thank you.
I take note of the points raised by the representative of the Russian Federation. This debate is being held on the one-year anniversary since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, and the presidency sees value in allowing Ukraine's foreign minister take the floor before all the other members of the Council on this occasion as per Rule 33 of Note 507. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a statement. I give them the floor.
Господин председатель, я
Mr.
хотел бы вас
President,
предупредить,
I would like to
что
just
как
warn
только вы
you
сейчас ударите
that the
молотком,
moment you
тем самым
put the gavel down,
формализовав ваше решение,
thus
будет
formalizing
создан
your
вопиющий
decision, you will
прецедент,
create an
когда
egregious
представителям Украины в Совете
where
даются
representatives of
привилегии, в
Ukraine
которых
in the
отказывается
Council are given the
представителям
kind of
других
privilege that
регионов.
is denied to the
Я могу
representative
привести вам
of others.
конкретные
Let
примеры
me
из
just give
недавней
you
практики.
a specific example from recent
Заседание под
practice.
САР 21 февраля
The
сего года.
meeting on
Госпожа
car on the
Валерий
21st of
Бойко
February
Тимон,
this
министр иностранных
year,
дел
the
ЦАР,
Minister of Foreign Affairs
выступала
of CAR,
после
Ms.
членов Совета.
Valerie, spoke after
27
members
января
of the
сего
Council.
года.
On the 27th
На
of
заседании по
February,
Мали
we had a meeting in
министр
Mali,
иностранных
and the
дел
Minister
этой
of Foreign
страны
Affairs
Абдуллаев
of that
Диop
country,
также
Mr. Bio,
выступал после
also
членов
took the
Совета.
floor after members of the
11
Council.
января
On the
сего года заседание
11th
по
of
Колумбии
January, we had a meeting on
колумбийский
Colombia, and the Vice
подчеркнул,
President of
даже не
Colombia,
министр
and let me
иностранных
underscore
дел,
this, not a minister,
вице-президент
but the
Франции
Vice
Маркес Мино
President,
выступала после
Mr.
членов СБ.
Mino, spoke after members of the
24
Council. On the
января
24th of
заседание
January
по
this
Гаити
year, we had a meeting on
министр
Haiti, and the
иностранных
Minister
дел
of Foreign
Доминиканской
Affairs of the
республики
Dominican
Роберто
Republic,
Альварес Гил
Mr. Alvarez
выступал
Gil,
после всех
took the
членов
floor
СБ.
after all members of the Council
Аналогично
have
после
spoken.
членов СБ он выступал на заседании по Гаити 21 декабря
And he
2022
also
года.
spoke after
список
all
таких
Security
примеров
Council
можно
meetings,
продолжить.
members at the meeting of Haiti
Если
later
говорить
on
о
in the year. And I
прецедентах, то сам
can
Дмитрий
continue
Кулеба
on with the
выступал
list. If
в
we're
Совете
talking about
Безопасности
precedents, well,
22
Mr.
сентября
Kuleba took
22
the
года после
floor
всех
on the
членов СБ.
22nd of September 2022,
Ни
and he
разу
spoke after
никто
all
из
members of the
западных
Council.
делегаций
There hasn't been
не
a single
предложил
case, a
заслушать
single
представителей
proposal
африканских,
from Western delegation to
латиноамериканских,
give the floor to
да и вообще
representative of
каких-либо других
African,
регионов, кроме
Latin
Украины,
American, or
на
any other
заседания,
countries other
которые
than
непосредственно
Ukraine
их
to give,
затрагивают до
to
того, как
give
выступят
them the floor
члены
and
СБ.
meetings which directly affect them, that
Вы
they speak
понимаете, как в глазах
before
всего
members of the
остального мира
Council.
будет
Can
выглядеть
you
сегодняшнее ваше решение
see
дать Дмитрию
what
Кулебе
your
привилегированное
decision
право
to provide Mr.
выступить в
Kuleba
начале
with a
заседания?
privileged right to speak at the beginning
Еще раз хочу
of the
подчеркнуть,
meeting
мы
in the
не
eyes of
имеем
the
ничего
world?
против
Once
выступления
again,
Дмитрия
we
Кулебы
have
как
nothing
такового и готовы
against
его выслушать.
a statement that will be made by
Но
Mr.
это
Kuleba
должно
such
быть
stand
строго в
ready to listen to
соответствии
it.
с
But this is
сложившейся
be done
практикой,
strictly
когда
in line with the
делегации по правилу
practice we
37
have when the
выступают после членов
delegations
Совета.
under Rule 37 speak after the members of the Council.
То же, что мы наблюдаем сейчас,
What
это
we're
очередная
witnessing
попытка
today is
утвердить
yet
право
another
отдельной
attempt
группы
to give certain rights to a group of the country, whereas you, as a representative of the Golden Billion, give preference to Ukraine just because that she is a part of your geopolitical project. It turns out that it would seem that the problems of the rest of the world are of no concern to you. The same applies to the unprecedented number of delegations invited today under Rule 37. 12 EU countries, in addition to the High Representative, Josep Borrell. It's clear that all of these countries who have the same EU position dictated from Brussels will bring in no added value to the discussion. No added value. Such an approach devalues the value of the discussion and strikes against the reputation of the Council. Our British colleagues have already joined history as a bad faith presidents of the Council, where they rejected our request for a special emergency session of the Council, which was unprecedented. And we regret the fact that the Maltese presidency time and time again ignored the rules of procedure of the Council and thus placed its own national position, the position of the EU, above its responsibility of presidency, which is supposed to make sure that the procedures are upheld and be impartial. We must acknowledge that Malta is not carrying out this task, and this confirms us in our opinion that there is no added value to expand the Council with Western countries, because you are turning the Council into your own instrument. I thank you.
Once again, I take note of the points raised by the representative of the Russian Federation. May I also remind that, for instance, the foreign minister of Serbia spoke before the Security Council members at least twice in the last two meetings on UNMIK. And with regard to the list of speakers under Rule 37, the presidency took note of the fact that all these requests came from foreign ministers who took the time to travel to New York to be at the United Nations on this anniversary. This clearly indicates that they feel that their countries have been and are still being directly impacted by this war. The agenda is adopted. I would like to warmly welcome the Secretary General and the distinguished ministers and other high-level representatives. Your presence today underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Croatia, Czech, Estonia, Germany, Hungary, Italy, Latvia, Netherlands, North Macedonia, Poland, Republic of Moldova, Romania, Slovakia, Spain, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite His Excellency Mr. Josep Borrell, High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. And I now give the floor to the Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres.
Mr. President, Excellencies, the purposes and principles embedded in the United Nations Charter are not a matter of convenience. They are not merely words on paper. They are at the core of who we are, and they reflect the driving mission of our United Nations. And they exist precisely to address any grievance, whatever it may be. 1 year ago, I sat in this Council and urged, and I quote, "In the name of humanity, do not allow to start in Europe what could be the worst war since the beginning of the century, with consequences not only devastating for Ukraine, not only tragic for the Russian Federation, but with an impact we cannot even foresee in relation to the consequences for the global economy." End of quote. I said then that we must give peace a chance, but peace has had no chance. War has ruled the day. The Russian invasion of Ukraine is a blatant violation of the United Nations Charter and international law. It has unleashed widespread deaths, destruction, and displacement. Attacks on civilian and civilian infrastructure have caused many casualties and terrible suffering. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has documented dozens of cases of conflict-related sexual violence against men, women, and girls, and serious violations of international humanitarian and human rights law against prisoners of war, and hundreds of cases of enforced disappearances and arbitrary detentions of civilians were also documented. Mr. President, life is a living hell for the people of Ukraine. An estimated 17.6 million people, nearly 40% of the population of Ukraine, require humanitarian assistance and protection. The crisis has erased 30% of pre-war jobs. The World Food Programme estimates that nearly 40% of Ukrainians are unable to afford or access enough food. And the war has sparked a displacement crisis not seen in Europe in decades. More than 8 million Ukrainian refugees have been recorded across Europe, in addition to an estimated 5.4 million who have been internally displaced. More than half of all Ukrainian children have been forced from their homes, with unaccompanied and separated children facing grave risks of violence, abuse, and exploitation. Vital infrastructure is under fire. Water, energy, and heating systems have been destroyed in the depths of a freezing winter. The World Health Organization has verified over 700 attacks on healthcare facilities, and more than 3,000 schools and colleges have been damaged or destroyed. Millions of students have had their education severely disrupted. Less measurable, but no less important, is the devastating impact of months of displacement and bombardment on the mental health of Ukrainians. Nearly 10 million people, including 7.8 million children, are at risk of acute post-traumatic stress disorder. And make no mistake, the Russian Federation is also suffering the deadly consequences. Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
nous avons besoin de
we
paix,
need peace.
une paix conforme à la
Peace
Charte
in
des
line
Nations Unies
with
et au
the
droit
United
international.
Nations Charter and international law.
Tout en œuvrant pour la paix, nous
As we work
continuerons
for peace,
d'appeler
we will
à agir
continue
sur plusieurs
calling
fronts.
for action on many fronts.
La protection des civils
Protection
doit
of
demeurer la
civilians
priorité
must
absolue.
remain the top priority.
Les attaques contre les
Attacks
civils et les
on
infrastructures
civilians
civiles
and
doivent
civilian
cesser.
infrastructure must stop.
L'emploi d'armes
The
explosives
use
à
of
effet
explosive
étendu dans les
weapons
zones
with
peuplées,
wide
dans les
area
villes et les
effects in
villages doit
populated
prendre
areas
fin.
in towns, cities and
Un accès
villages
humanitaire
must
sûr et
end.
sans entrave
Safe and
doit être
unimpeded
garanti
humanitarian access
afin
for
d'acheminer une aide
life-saving
vitale.
assistance
Et il nous faut
must be
également investir
ensured.
dans le
We must
redressement
also
et la
invest in
reconstruction
Ukraine's
de l'Ukraine.
recovery and reconstruction.
À la demande du gouvernement
At the
ukrainien et au
request
nom
of
du
the
système
Ukrainian
des Nations
government
Unies,
and
le
on
programme
behalf
des
of the
Nations
United
Unies pour le
Nations
développement
system, the United Nations
procède
Development
conjointement avec la
Programme
Banque mondiale à
is
une évaluation
co-leading
des
an
dégâts
assessment
aux
of damage
infrastructures
to energy
énergétiques.
infrastructure jointly with the World Bank.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
depuis le début de la
since the
guerre,
start of
l'Agence
the war,
internationale de
the
l'énergie
International
atomique
Atomic
a
Energy
aidé
Agency
l'Ukraine à
has
assurer la
supported
sûreté et la
Ukraine to
sécurité
ensure
de
the
ses 15
safety and
réacteurs
security
en
of its
service dans
15
4
operating
centrales
reactors
nucléaires,
at
dont la
4
plus grande
nuclear
centrale nucléaire
plants,
d'Europe, à
including
Zaporizhzhia.
Europe's largest nuclear power
Nous
plant in
continuons d'exhorter
Zaporizhzhia.
toutes les parties à
We continue
s'entendre
to
et à
urge
mettre en
all
œuvre
parties to
rapidement
swiftly
une
agree
zone de
and
sûreté et de
implement
sécurité
a nuclear
nucléaire à la centrale
safety and
nucléaire de
security
Zaporizhzhia
protection zone at
afin
the
d'éviter
Zaporizhzhia
un
nuclear
grave
power
accident
plant
qui pourrait
to
avoir des
avoid a serious
conséquences
accident with
catastrophiques.
potentially disastrous
Les
consequences.
menaces à peine voilées de recours à l'arme
Barely veiled
nucléaire dans le
threats
cadre
to
du
use
conflit
nuclear weapons
ont fait
in the
grimper le
context
risque
of the
nucléaire à un niveau
conflict
jamais
have
vu depuis les
spiked
jours les
nuclear
plus sombres de
risks
la
to
guerre
levels
froide
not seen
et
since the
ces menaces
darkest
sont
days of the Cold
inacceptables.
War. These threats are
Mr.
unacceptable.
President, progress continues to be made under the Black Sea Grain Initiative, an agreement brokered with the parties by the United Nations and the government of Turkey. More than 20 million metric tons of foodstuffs have now been safely reconnected to global supply chains on more than 700 ships, helping to bring down prices around the world. I want to underscore the importance of all parties remaining engaged in this initiative and reiterate our call for it to be extended beyond March 2023. And the United Nations is firmly committed to working to remove remaining obstacles to Russian food and fertilizer exports, including ammonia. These exports are essential to our broader efforts to bring down prices and ease food insecurity around the globe. Both efforts demonstrate that international cooperation is essential, valuable, and possible, even in the midst of conflict. Mr. President, over the past year, this Council has held more than 40 debates on Ukraine. The guns are talking now, but in the end, we all know, that the path of diplomacy and accountability is the road to a just and sustainable peace. Peace in line with UN Charter, international law, and yesterday's resolution of the General Assembly. We must prevent further escalation. We must all encourage every meaningful effort to end the bloodshed and at long last give peace a chance. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Dmytro Kuleba, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, Secretary General, first of all, I would like to thank the Presidency of Malta for convening this important meeting. The General Assembly has just passed a resolution on the principles of comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. 141 member states took the side of the UN Charter, while 7 took the side of Russia. No additional explanations are required here. The resolution follows the logic of President Zelensky's peace formula. The goal of this 10-point plan is to restore respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, in full compliance with the UN Charter that we all have committed to respect and uphold. To make it short, the goal of the plan is to get Russia out of Ukraine and make the world a safer place. Obviously, any new peace proposals should now be aligned with demands set forth by the resolution. We invite all countries from every corner of the world to facilitate implementation of the resolution and the peace formula. We need to act jointly and quickly. To ensure nuclear safety and security, by forcing Russia to withdraw from the illegally occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and stopping missile attacks that endanger nuclear power plants across the territory of Ukraine. To avoid the threat of hunger, by furthering the Black Sea Grain Initiative and countering Russian efforts to undermine it, as well as by developing our Grain from Ukraine initiative. To prevent an energy crisis which will require the cessation of Russian missile terror against critical infrastructure of Ukraine. To protect the environment, as the Russian shelling that burned millions of hectares of Ukrainian forests threatens our efforts to counter global warming. But first and foremost, people must be saved. Their lives and their rights are at the center of our struggle for peace. The magnitude of the humanitarian crisis brought on by Russia's aggression against Ukraine cannot be overstated. I would like to highlight here only one of numerous horrendous facts. Russia is now implementing in Ukraine probably the largest instance of state-sponsored kidnapping of children in history of our modern world. Dear members of the Council, Ukraine will resist as it has done so far, and Ukraine will win. Putin is going to lose much sooner than he thinks. Here is what Russian officials and servicemen have to know. You think you would get away with what you did? No. You will end up on trial. You will be testifying how strongly you were opposed to the aggression and how you just followed orders. You think that the world will get tired of supporting Ukraine? The support will only get stronger. You think that Ukraine will eventually tire of defending itself? The more and the longer you will keep attacking Ukraine, the more resolve we will have and the more humiliating your defeat will be. Dear colleagues, Russian propaganda has fabricated this hypocritical narrative that supplying Ukraine with weapons fuels the war. Ukraine indeed needs weapons, just as a firefighter needs water to extinguish a fire. The fire that is destroying your home and killing innocent people. The sooner and the more we get, the sooner the fire will be extinguished. Arming a country that defends itself from the aggression is absolutely legitimate and is an act of defending the UN Charter. On the contrary, helping an aggressor is illegitimate and defies the Charter. Any supply of weapons or military equipment to Russia means complicity in the trampling of the UN Charter. If you give weapons to Russia, you commit a crime. In the short term, Ukraine needs to restore its sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. And in the long run, justice must be served. The Nuremberg International Military Tribunal's verdict was crystal clear. War of aggression is not only a war crime. It is the supreme international crime, distinguishing itself from other war crimes only in that it contains the accumulated evil of the whole. This is why we call for the establishment of the special tribunal with specific jurisdiction over the crime of aggression against Ukraine and the ability to deal with personal immunities of principal perpetrators of this crime. The geography of Russian crimes against international peace and security goes far beyond the borders of Ukraine and reaches Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Russia not only incites conflicts, but also systemically obstructs UN Security Council decisions needed to resolve them. Today, Russia argued that this council is overly focused on Ukraine and ignores problems of the rest of the world. Let us all remember the truth. Russia is the problem of the world. I opened the UN Charter that I have here in front of me, and I do not see the words, member states can attack other member states at their will, end of quote. I don't see the words, violating borders is allowed. And furthermore, and most importantly, I do not see the words, the Russian Federation in the UN Charter, on the list of permanent Security Council members. In 1991, Russia usurped the USSR seat of the permanent Security Council member and turned it into the throne of impunity. The future of Russia in the United Nations should be determined in the context of the illegitimate change of plates from USSR to Russia in 1991 and responsibility for crimes committed on the territory of Ukraine, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. I say it again and again, peace means justice. And all the peace-loving nations will win peace on the battlefield and at the diplomatic tables. Finally, on this tragic day, when we mourn lives and destinies broken by Russia, I kindly ask everyone to observe a minute of silence in memory of the victims of the aggression. I thank you, Mr. President.
The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a statement.
Господин председатель, мы встаем, чтобы почтить память всех жертв произошедшего на Украине, начиная с 2014 года, всех погибших, любая жизнь бесценна. Поэтому мы встаем в память о всех этих людях.
I thank the representative for their statement. Can you write? I thank His Excellency, Mr. Kuleba, for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as Minister for Foreign and European Affairs and Trade of Malta. I begin by thanking Secretary General Gutierrez for his briefing and Minister Kuleba for his statement. Excellencies, we have convened to mark 1 year since the Russian Federation launched its aggression against Ukraine. This brutal, unprovoked, and unjustified war is a blatant violation of the United Nations Charter and international law. It has brought immense suffering, destruction, and misery on Ukraine.
It's important to us. I think it's important to everyone. Now, I think with all we can start talking. Yes, don't forget
around the globe. At the outset, I reiterate that every state has the sovereign right to self-determination, including the choice of its own destiny, in order to ensure its safety and security. Over the past 12 months, Ukrainians have shown incredible courage and resilience by defending not solely their right to exist in the face of a brutal military aggression, but also the values and principles underpinning the international rules-based order. Over the past year, various UN and international mechanisms have provided evidence of indiscriminate killings of civilians, attacks on civilian infrastructure, torture, and other forms of cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment, sexual and gender-based violence, abductions, and forcible deportation of children. Such actions constitute serious violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, and are a grave breach of the Fourth Geneva Convention. These children must be returned to their families or legal guardians without delay. The tragic impact of these transfers and deportations on Ukrainian children will be felt for generations to come. We must redouble our efforts to ensure accountability for violations of the UN Charter and international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. This must include justice for victims of atrocity crimes and sexual violence. Perpetrators must be brought to justice and held to account without delay. We therefore welcome the important work being carried out by the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. We also reaffirm our support for the mechanisms that are working in this fight against impunity. We stand with the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court in his investigations and continue to consider ways to ensure accountability for the crime of aggression. We also call on the Russian Federation to respect the ruling of the International Court of Justice ordering an immediate suspension of military operations. On this occasion, I must also express our deep concern with regard to nuclear safety in Ukraine. Shelling in and around nuclear power plants in Ukraine, including Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, constitutes a grave environmental and health threat and a serious risk to international peace and security. Such actions can lead to a grave humanitarian and environmental catastrophe with long-term repercussions. In the context of a deteriorating global non-proliferation architecture, any declarations by Russia suggesting that the possible use of nuclear weapons is in any way justified are unacceptable. Such rhetoric only leads to uncertainty, further undermines trust between parties, and only serves as a means to escalate the conflict and heighten tensions. This aggression also had serious repercussions on the rules-based international order that we have all agreed to. As members of the international community, our collective security depends on these common principles underpinned by the notion that might is not right. No state or power has the right to redraw borders in accordance to its geopolitical interests. Malta reaffirms its full support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. As committed multilateralists, it is our duty to defend and promote these principles and to counter contempt for them. In closing, as a member of the Security Council, Malta will continue to support all efforts to address the consequences of Russia's aggression. We also reiterate that the only step towards a lasting peace would be for Russia to immediately cease all hostilities and to unconditionally, completely withdraw all of its forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I resume my function as President of the Council. And I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State of the United States of America.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, fellow Council members, 1 year and 1 week ago, on February 17th, 2022, I warned this Council that Russia was planning to invade Ukraine. I said that Russia would manufacture a pretext and then use missiles, tanks, soldiers, cyber attacks to strike pre-identified targets, including Kyiv, with the aim of toppling Ukraine's democratically elected government. Russia's representative, the same representative who will speak today, called these, and I quote, groundless accusations. 7 days later, on February 24th, 2022, Russia launched its full-scale invasion. Due to fierce resistance by Ukraine's defenders, President Putin failed in his primary objective to conquer Ukraine, end its existence as an independent country, and absorb it into Russia. Then, he dusted off his Crimea playbook from 2014. He called snap referenda in 4 occupied parts of Ukraine, deported Ukrainians, bussed in Russians, held sham votes at gunpoint, and then manipulated the results to claim near unanimous support for joining the Russian Federation. When President Putin couldn't break the Ukrainian military, he intensified efforts to break Ukrainian spirit. Over the last year, Russia has killed tens of thousands of Ukrainian men, women, and children, uprooted more than 13 million people from their homes, destroyed more than half of the country's energy grid, bombed more than 700 hospitals, 2,600 schools, and abducted at least 6,000 Ukrainian children, some as young as 4 months old, and relocated them to Russia. And yet, the spirit of the Ukrainians remains unbroken. If anything, it's stronger than ever. When Ukraine launched a counteroffensive that retook large swaths of its territory, President Putin conscripted an additional 300,000 men, throwing more and more of Russia's young people into a meat grinder of his own making. And he unleashed the Wagner Group, mercenaries who have committed atrocities from Africa to the Middle East and now in Ukraine. Of course, that's not the whole story of the last year. There's also the story of Ukraine's people. Vastly outnumbered, they have fought bravely to defend their nation, their freedom, the right to determine their own future. and they've demonstrated inspiring unity in helping one another endure Moscow's relentless assault. Teachers and community members give classes in bunkers to children. City workers improvise patches to restore heat and power and water to residents. Neighbors set up soup kitchens to feed the hungry. There's also the story of how the international community has come together. The vast majority of member states have voted multiple times to condemn Russia's violations of the UN Charter and reject its illegal attempt to seize Ukrainian territory. Yesterday, 141 countries voted in the General Assembly for a resolution that reaffirms the core principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, denounces Russia's atrocities, expresses support for a just and comprehensive peace in accordance with the United Nations Charter. When President Putin tried to weaponize hunger, exploiting the worst global food crisis since the creation of the UN, the international community responded swiftly. Since the United States chaired a food security meeting last May, more than 100 countries have signed on to a set of concrete commitments to alleviate hunger. Thanks in large part to the Secretary General, Guterres, and Turkey, the Black Sea Grain Initiative loosened Russia's stranglehold on Ukraine's ports and brought down the cost of grain for the world. Now, as Moscow again tries to throttle its output, we have to ensure that that initiative is extended and expanded. When President Putin tried to weaponize energy, we redirected natural gas supplies from across the world so that countries Russia targeted could keep their people warm in the winter. And Europe took extraordinary steps to end its dependence on Russian energy. No country has endured greater hardship from Russia's war than Ukraine. But almost every country has felt the pain. And yet, nations around the world continue to stand with Ukraine. Because we all recognize that if we abandon Ukraine, we abandon the UN Charter itself and the principles and rules that make all countries safer and more secure. No seizing land by force. No erasing another country's borders. No targeting civilians in war. No wars of aggression. If we do not defend these basic principles, we invite a world in which might makes right, the strong dominate the weak. That's the world this body was created to end. And members of this council have a unique responsibility to make sure that we do not return to it. We can do that in three ways. First, we must push for a just and durable peace. Now, I expect that many countries will call for peace today. No one wants peace more than the Ukrainian people. And the United States has long made clear, even before this war, that we're prepared to engage in any meaningful diplomatic effort to stop Russia's aggression against Ukraine. But history teaches us that it's the nature of peace that matters. For peace to be just, it must uphold the principles at the heart of the UN Charter: sovereignty, territorial integrity, independence. For peace to be durable, it must ensure that Russia can't simply rest, rearm, and relaunch the war in a few months or a few years. Any peace that legitimizes Russia's seizure of land by force will weaken the Charter and send a message to would-be aggressors everywhere that they can invade countries and get away with it. President Zelensky has put forward a 10-point plan for a just and durable peace. President Putin, by contrast, has made clear that there's nothing to talk about until Ukraine accepts, and I quote, the new territorial realities, while doubling down on his brutal tactics. Members of this Council have a fundamental responsibility to ensure that any peace is just and durable. Council members should not be fooled by calls for a temporary or unconditional ceasefire. Russia will use any pause in fighting to consolidate control over the territory it's illegally seized and replenish its forces for further attacks. That's what happened when Russia's first assault on Ukraine froze in 2015. Look at what followed. And members of this Council should not fall into the false equivalency of calling on both sides to stop fighting or calling on other nations to stop supporting Ukraine in the name of peace. No member of this Council should call for peace while supporting Russia's war on Ukraine and on the UN Charter. In this war, there is an aggressor and there is a victim. Russia fights for conquest. Ukraine fights for its freedom. If Russia stops fighting and leaves Ukraine, the war ends. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends. The fact remains, one man, Vladimir Putin, started this war. One man can end it. Second, even as we work to end Russia's war against Ukraine, members of this Council must continue to address other challenges to international peace and security. We hear the concerns of countries who worry that standing with Ukraine and holding Russia accountable is diverting focus and resources from others in need. To those countries, I would say simply, look at our actions. And when you hear Russia and its defenders accuse the countries who support Ukraine of ignoring the rest of the world, I say, look at Moscow's actions. Compare the numbers. In addition to the $13.5 billion in food aid that the United States contributed to fight hunger over the last year, we also fund more than 40% of the World Food Programme's budget. Russia contributes less than 1% of that budget. That's not an outlier. Based on the latest UN figures, the United States donates over 9 times as much as Russia to UN peacekeeping. We donate 390 times as much as Russia to UNICEF. We give nearly 1,000 times as much as Russia to the UN Refugee Agency. Third, we must reaffirm our commitment to upholding what the UN Charter calls, and I quote, the dignity and worth of the human person. We must continue to compile evidence of Russia's ongoing and widespread atrocities, including executions, torture, rape and sexual violence, the deportation of thousands of Ukrainian civilians to Russia. We must continue to document Russia's war crimes and crimes against humanity and share this evidence with investigators and prosecutors so that one day the perpetrators can be held accountable. Day after day of Russia's atrocities, it's easy to become numb to the horror, to lose our ability to feel shock and outrage. But we can never let the crimes Russia is committing become our new normal. Bucha is not normal. Mariupol is not normal. Irpin is not normal. Bombing schools and hospitals and apartment buildings to rubble is not normal. Stealing Ukrainian children from their families and giving them to people in Russia is not normal. We must not let President Putin's callous indifference to human life become our own. We must force ourselves to remember that behind every atrocity in this wretched war, in conflicts around the world, is a human being. I recently visited an exhibit of artwork made by Ukrainian children affected by the war. One painting I saw was made by a 10-year-old girl named Veronica. Last April, Russian forces shelled her home in Vuhledar, killing her whole family. When first responders dug her from the rubble, a piece of shrapnel was lodged in her skull. Her left thumb had been ripped off. Doctors saved her life, but the attack left her right hand mostly paralyzed, and she can't see out of her left eye. In her painting, Veronica drew herself in a bright pink and orange dress, holding a bouquet of flowers. A building stands next to her. When asked who lived there, she said it was a place where all the people she knew who had been killed in the war could be safe. We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. That's how the UN Charter begins. Fellow members of this Council, now is the time to meet that promise. There are so many people in Ukraine who want the same thing as that little girl, Veronica. A world where they can live in peace, in their own country, and keep the people they love safe. We have the power. We have the responsibility to create that world today and for generations to come. We cannot, we will not let one country destroy it. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Blinken, for his statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Solta Shachka, Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of Albania.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, distinguished members of the Council, let me start by thanking Malta for organizing this meeting and you, Minister, for chairing it. We are grateful to the Secretary General for his powerful words and also for his continued genuine efforts to end the war in Ukraine and, above all, for his moral clarity during this unprecedented crisis. Colleagues, this is a tragic anniversary. There is nothing to celebrate, rather everything to regret. But still there is one crucial thing to note and never forget. Out of a disastrous war and its terrible consequences, we've seen a world remarkably united in condemning a war of choice, in refusing territorial annexation by force, in upholding the international law and in defending the UN Charter. Again yesterday, 141 member states from all corners of the world confirmed with a resounding voice that they do not want a world according to Russia, but a world according to the UN Charter. But they want peace, a just peace for Ukraine and its people, in line with President Zelensky's peace plan. Colleagues, 1 year ago, Russian troops rushed across the borders of Ukraine and Russian missiles filled its sky, unleashing the brutal war that continues to this hour. With Russia, what Russia started on this very day last year has been cataclysmic for Ukraine, earth-shattering for Europe, history-shaping for the world. Thousands of civilians have lost their lives, millions of children have lost their schools, countless people have lost their homes, millions more have been displaced, and the damage to the infrastructure and economy of Ukraine is simply unfathomable. Millions around the world, especially the poorest and most vulnerable, have suffered greatly because of the global ripple effects, especially in the spike of food crisis. Throughout the year, the world has witnessed with dismay, has verified and documented despicable crimes, executions, rape, pillaging, torture, deportation of children, war crimes and crimes against humanity committed by the invader. We have witnessed thousands of convicts being pressed into service and used as cannon fodder in the ranks of the Wagner Group, a murderous machine with a notorious footprint in other parts of the world. And the most appalling of all of it is that an unjust, illegal, and unprovoked war of aggression against an innocent country and people is perpetrated by a permanent member of the Council who bears a special responsibility for guaranteeing peace and security and for upholding the UN Charter and international law. Instead, it has chosen to behave like a rogue state, going against the law, against the rules, against the world. The truth is that despite everything, Ukraine is still here. Its people are suffering but fighting, resisting bravely in defending their land, their freedom, their future. And they are not alone. Their fight is also the fight of everyone who aspires for peace. And I have to echo, and I strongly agree with Minister Kuleba, that peace means justice. Mr. President, Russian leaders like to talk about history and their country's role in it. And Russia, of course, has much to be proud of during its history. But countries and their leaders are judged above all by their ability to learn from the past and their actions in the present. And at the present, Russia has nothing to be proud of. With its wrong actions, with its disastrous policy and its criminal war, Russia has isolated itself, and it has only itself to blame for it. The sooner ordinary Russians will understand this, the sooner this madness will stop. Colleagues, this war must end, and it will end. But the end we envisage is the end of aggression, not the end of the rules-based world order. It is the end of the presence of Russian troops in Ukraine, not the end of life there. It is the end of unnecessary suffering, not the end of hope. There must be and will be a future with a just and stable peace, with a free and secure Ukraine, sovereign and with its territorial integrity restored, and we look forward to the day, and I hope soon, of the start of a process of healing and reconstruction. But until that day comes, Ukraine and its people deserve all of our political, economic, and military support, all our continued solidarity in their heroic resistance to defend themselves, to defend the right and the just. Slava Ukraini. Thank you for your attention.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Chachka, for her statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Juan Carlos Holguin, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Human Mobility of Ecuador.
Gracias, señor presidente, por convocar a este debate cuando se cumple un año de la agresión militar sobre Ucrania. Los primeros bombardeos que iniciaron mientras este Consejo se reunía en esta misma sala pulverizaron los esfuerzos diplomáticos de la comunidad internacional y el clamor del secretario general Antonio Guterres, que pedía a la Federación de Rusia que le diera a la paz una oportunidad. Hoy me enfocaré en tres puntos centrales. Primero, las graves consecuencias humanitarias y globales de esta guerra. Segundo, lo que este Consejo y las Naciones Unidas han podido hacer. Y tercero, lo que hace falta para el restablecimiento de la paz y la seguridad. Señor presidente, las consecuencias de esta agresión militar fueron desastrosas desde el primer día. De hecho, 72 horas después, el secretario general adjunto informó a este órgano sobre el escenario humanitario de horror. Entre los cientos de miles de personas que querían huir de esta absurda agresión de Rusia, estaban cerca de 1,000 ecuatorianos. Muchos de ellos debimos evacuar en el marco de operaciones de emergencia, de manera coordinada junto a otros países de Sudamérica como Colombia, Perú y México. Muchos de esos ecuatorianos fueron para nosotros testimonio vivo de las graves consecuencias humanitarias de la invasión que se siguen deteriorando día tras día y minuto a minuto, incluso mientras debatimos en este momento. Este no es un conflicto que se centra en Ucrania, fue un ataque al mundo, es una agresión a América Latina también. Con 14 millones de personas forzadas a salir de sus hogares, 8 millones refugiadas en Europa y casi 6 millones de desplazados internos, las más afectadas son las mujeres, las niñas y los niños. La guerra tiene cerca de 18 millones de personas bajo necesidades de protección y asistencia. La destrucción de empleos y la devastación económica agravan esta tragedia inducida y ponen en situación de estrés a los mecanismos de protección de los derechos humanos. Las ejecuciones sumarias, la violencia sexual y basada en el género, la tortura y otros tratos inhumanos y degradantes son parte de los ingredientes de crueldad de esta guerra. Hace un año este Consejo fue advertido de cuán brutal y prolongada podía ser la guerra urbana. Esa advertencia no fue suficiente para detener el uso de explosivos en zonas pobladas y los ataques dirigidos contra infraestructura crítica, energética, residencial, sanitaria, educativa y productiva y contra el patrimonio de la cultura e identidad de Ucrania, incluyendo museos y sitios religiosos. Este conflicto, que está infligiendo dolor y destrucción sobre el pueblo de Ucrania, exacerbó además la amenaza nuclear, agravó la inseguridad alimentaria global y afectó las economías, en particular de los países en desarrollo. Asimismo, afectó la dinámica de trabajo de este Consejo y la confianza en el sistema de Naciones Unidas, lo que me lleva a mi segundo punto. En estos 12 meses, el sistema de Naciones Unidas se ha movilizado. El Consejo de Seguridad se ha reunido por lo menos 40 veces para considerar la situación en Ucrania, cuyo presidente incluso ha podido participar por medios telemáticos. Este Consejo, gracias al mecanismo Unión Pro Paz, con su resolución 2623, convocó al 11º periodo extraordinario de sesiones de emergencia de la Asamblea General, que adoptó 6 resoluciones centradas, entre otros, en la integridad territorial, la cuestión humanitaria, la rendición de cuentas y la que acabamos de adoptar ayer con una votación abrumadora sobre los principios de la Carta de Naciones Unidas en los que se basa una paz general, justa y duradera. Por su parte, el pasado 16 de marzo de 2022, la Corte Internacional de Justicia ordenó a la Federación de Rusia suspender de inmediato sus operaciones militares, y el secretario general ha sido clave por su actuación sobre la evacuación de civiles, liberación de prisioneros y otros asuntos humanitarios, incluyendo la iniciativa del grano del Mar Negro. El Organismo Internacional de Energía Atómica también se encuentra desplegado en las centrales nucleares de Ucrania para reducir los riesgos existentes. Señor presidente, como expuesto, Naciones Unidas está movilizada, pero nada, ningún esfuerzo será suficiente ante el dolor de miles de padres o madres que siguen enterrando a sus hijos y el drama de esos miles de niños y niñas huérfanos. ¿Cómo justificamos ante esa generación del pueblo de Ucrania que un día se despertó bajo el asedio de las bombas, los misiles y la pólvora para no ver más a sus seres queridos, porque unos murieron y otros huyeron? ¿Cuántos horrores más deben pasar para que termine esta absurda guerra? ¿Cuántas sesiones más de este Consejo hacen falta para detener la agresión militar contra Ucrania? Esto me lleva a mi tercer y último punto sobre lo que todavía podemos y debemos hacer. Primero, el Consejo debe rechazar sin ambigüedades los intentos de anexión de territorios basados en la fuerza y la violencia como herramienta de dominación entre los Estados. Esta no es una visión de Occidente, como se escucha una y otra vez. Este es un principio sagrado para los países en desarrollo, cuyo único arsenal es el derecho internacional y sus municiones son los dispositivos de la Carta. Segundo, debe terminar inmediatamente el abuso y la aplicación parcial del artículo 27.3 de la Carta, por la cual la parte en una controversia debe abstenerse de votar. Tercero, los miembros del Consejo, de manera colectiva o individual, debemos redoblar nuestro apoyo para los esfuerzos y buenos oficios del secretario general, así como para las labores interagenciales. Cuarto, ¿qué mejor manera de honrar la vida de las víctimas de este conflicto que asegurando los mecanismos de investigación independientes, la rendición de cuentas y la reparación como herramientas de resarcimiento, pero también de disuasión? Y finalmente, lo más importante, la Federación de Rusia debe poner fin de inmediato a la guerra no provocada e injustificable, retirando sus tropas de ocupación para permitir un alto al fuego realista encaminado al restablecimiento de la paz y la seguridad en Ucrania, fundamentadas en el respeto a su soberanía, integridad territorial e independencia política. Hoy, por todos los niños y niñas que murieron y los heridos y por los que viven todavía bajo el espectro de las bombas, hacemos un llamado para que esta guerra no dure un día más. Muchas gracias.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Huguin, for his statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Ignacio Cassis, Federal Counselor and Head of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Mesdames et Messieurs les membres du Conseil, Mesdames et Messieurs les membres de l'ONU, chers invités, je remercie le secrétaire général Antonio Guterres pour son engagement en faveur de la paix. Je tiens à vous assurer du soutien de la Suisse pour les actions de ce Conseil. Lors de ma première visite en Ukraine en octobre 2021, j'ai discuté avec les autorités politiques de réforme et de construction. Nous parlions alors d'un avenir stable et prospère pour ce pays. Le contraste avec ma deuxième visite l'automne dernier à Kiev, sous les bombes, est glaçant, est désolant. L'agression russe contre l'Ukraine est un énorme choc pour la Suisse, dépositaire et partie aux conventions de Genève. Mon pays est attaché aux principes de paix et de souveraineté portés par la Charte des Nations Unies. Depuis 12 mois, cette charte est violée et les conventions de Genève qui fixent des limites à la barbarie de la guerre sont bafouées. Mais la Suisse croit en la force du droit. J'appelle donc au respect intégral des règles essentielles du droit international humanitaire. La population civile, les blessés, les prisonniers et les infrastructures vitales doivent être protégés par toutes les parties au conflit et par tous les combattants. Il est plus que nécessaire de rappeler ces engagements auxquels nous tous, ici, dans cette salle, ici présents à l'ONU, avons souscrit. Nous devons tout faire pour assurer leur respect sur le territoire ukrainien à feu et à sang. Et que pouvons-nous faire concrètement? Nous pourrions par exemple nous réunir dans l'esprit de ces conventions de Genève, nous réunir pour discuter ensemble des moyens nécessaires à assurer qu'au cœur de ce conflit déchirant, on n'oublie pas ce qui nous définit en tant qu'hommes, le principe d'humanité. La Suisse est prête à tout moment à réunir tout le monde autour d'une table afin de travailler pour un meilleur respect du droit international humanitaire et finalement pour la paix. Nous commémorons l'année prochaine les 75 ans des conventions de Genève. N'attendons pas une année, nous devons agir maintenant. Monsieur le Président, chers collègues, après un an de guerre, nous devons mettre nos forces, nos idées, nos moyens en commun pour rétablir la sécurité en Europe et assurer le retour à une paix complète, juste et durable en Ukraine. La Suisse salue dès lors la résolution adoptée hier par l'Assemblée générale. Il s'agit d'un signal clair, exprimé par les États membres partisans dans leur vaste majorité pour la solidarité, le dialogue et la paix. Pour que la paix en Ukraine soit possible, je réitère aujourd'hui notre appel à la Russie. Il est grand temps de cesser toutes les hostilités, de retirer sans délai la totalité de ses troupes du territoire ukrainien. Les agressions, les menaces et la désinformation nuisent au fondement de l'ordre international. Pour nous en prévenir, nous avons besoin d'un multilatéralisme fort et efficace. Nous avons besoin de restaurer notre confiance à nous, notre confiance mutuelle, et de nous assurer que justice soit faite pour que la paix puisse être construite sur des fondations solides. En tant qu'État neutre permanent, la Suisse respecte pleinement ses obligations découlant du droit de la neutralité. Elle ne privilégie aucun des belligérants sur le plan militaire. Mais neutralité ne signifie pas indifférence. On ne peut pas être indifférent face aux violations de nos droits fondamentaux. Aux côtés de 40 autres États, la Suisse a déféré la situation en Ukraine à la Cour pénale internationale. Et j'appelle désormais tous les États à coopérer avec la Cour face à des rapports faisant état des crimes de guerre, de violences sexuelles et d'autres violations graves du droit international humanitaire et des droits de l'homme. Nous ne pouvons pas rester les bras croisés. Monsieur le Président, la Suisse continue à soutenir l'Ukraine. En même temps, la Suisse n'oublie pas les victimes de tous les autres conflits du monde. La Charte des Nations Unies doit nous servir de boussole au-delà des frontières et de nos convictions. La Suisse se place du côté du droit international. C'est une condition essentielle pour une paix durable. L'objectif auquel nous nous sommes engagés en tant que membres de ce Conseil de sécurité. Merci pour votre attention.
Thank you for your attention.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Kassis, for his statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Yoshimasa Hayashi, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank you for organizing this important meeting. My appreciation also goes to the Secretary General. 1 year ago today, right here in this very chamber, right in the middle of the discussion on how to prevent aggression against Ukraine, a permanent member of the Security Council launched an aggression against Ukraine in front of the wide open eyes of the Council members. It was an insult to the Security Council and to the entire United Nations. It demonstrated how little Russia cares about the UN. At that very moment, I remember vividly, Secretary General Guterres called on the Russian leader, I quote, "President Putin, stop the military operation, bring the troops back to Russia," unquote. His call still echoes in my ears. The call of the Secretary General represents the collective will of the member states, maybe except for a few, and it is reflected in the resolution of the General Assembly, including the one adopted just yesterday, and in the ICJ order on provisional measures. It is unfortunate that 1 year later, we still have to repeat the same call. Mr. President, Japan condemns Russia's aggression against Ukraine in the strongest possible terms. It is a clear violation of international law, including the UN Charter, by a permanent member of the Security Council, which is supposed to bear the heaviest responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. Russia must immediately stop its war of aggression, withdraw all of its troops and military equipment from Ukraine, and respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. No country is allowed to relight borders by force or coercion. Japan also condemns Russia's attacks against critical infrastructure. Indiscriminate attacks on innocent civilians are a violation of international humanitarian law and constitute a war crime. Russia's irresponsible nuclear rhetoric and its seizure and militarization of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant must be denounced as well. We commend and fully support the work of the IAEA to ensure nuclear safety and security at the plant. We must hold Russia accountable in accordance with international law. Mr. President, we will stand firmly with Ukraine. Japan welcomes President Zelensky's sincere efforts to demonstrate fundamental principles in its peace formula and to promote a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in accordance with the principles enshrined in the UN Charter. Before closing, allow me to reiterate that any attempts to change the status quo of territory by force or coercion must be rejected anywhere in the world. At the same time, the Security Council should not leave behind many other challenges that it has to deal with. Let us return to the unshakable principles that the member states have built upon since 1945. Let us unite for the rule of law. Let us uphold the rule of law for peace. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Hayashi, for his statement, and I now give the floor to Her Excellency, Ms. Catherine Colonna, Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of France.
Monsieur le Président, je vous remercie
Mr.
d'avoir
President, I
organisé
thank
cette
you for
réunion
having
et je
convened
tiens à
this
adresser un
meeting, and I
remerciement
wish to
particulier
extend particular
au
thanks
secrétaire général
to the Secretary
ainsi qu'à
General
Dimitro
and
Kuleba
to
pour leurs
Dumitru Kuleba
interventions.
for their statements.
Le 24 février
On the
2022,
24th of February
la Russie déclenchait
2022,
une guerre
Russia
d'agression
unleashed
contre
a war of
l'Ukraine,
aggression against
un pays
Ukraine.
dont elle occupait
It
déjà
had
depuis
already
8 ans
occupied a part
une
of that
partie du
country's
territoire.
territory for 8 years.
Elle l'a fait sans
It
autre
unleashed that
justification
war
que
with
son
no other
désir
justification than its
obsessionnel
obsessive
de faire
desire
revivre un
to
passé
resurrect a
pourtant condamné
past
par
which
l'histoire
had, however, been
et
condemned by
éluse depuis
history.
de la
And
violence
since then,
la
it
plus
has used
extrême
the most
pour
extreme
nier
violence
l'identité
to
d'un
deny
pays
the
et d'un
identity
peuple.
of a country and a people.
Cela fait aujourd'hui
Today marks
un
1
an
year
que la Russie
of
sème la mort et
Russia
la
sowing
destruction.
death and destruction. 1 year,
365 longs jours. Un an.
356
Un an qu'elle viole de
65 long
façon
days.
flagrante
That is 1
les
year.
principes
1 year
fondamentaux
of
de la
Russia
Charte des
flagrantly
Nations Unies,
violating the
alors
fundamental
même qu'elle est
principles
l'un
of
des
the
membres
Charter of the United
permanents
Nations.
du Conseil de
It does so
sécurité.
despite the fact that it is one of the
Un an de
permanent members
souffrance
of the
inhumaine pour
Security
le peuple
Council.
ukrainien,
1 year of
dont la
inhumane
résistance
suffering for the
et le
Ukrainian
courage
people,
forcent
whose resistance
l'admiration.
and courage
Un an de
command
crimes de guerre et de
admiration.
crimes contre
1
l'humanité.
year of
Un
war
an
crimes and crimes
d'exactions,
against humanity.
d'exécutions,
1 year of
de
violence,
bombardements contre les
executions, shelling
civils, de
of civilian
torture, de
targets, of
viols,
torture, rape,
d'enlèvement
of
et
abduction
de
and the
déportation
deportation
d'enfants.
of children.
Un an de
1
violations
year of
systématiques
systematic
des droits de
violations
l'homme
of
et du
human
droit
rights
international
and of
humanitaire.
international
Des
humanitarian
crimes sur
law.
lesquels la Cour pénale internationale
Crimes that the
enquête
International
et pour
Criminal
lesquels elle
Court
établira
is
le moment venu
investigating, and
les
crimes for
responsabilités,
which, when the time comes,
celles
it will
des
establish
exécutants comme celles
responsibilities,
des
those
commanditaires.
of the executioners and those of their
Un an
sponsors.
et des millions de
1
vies
year
volées,
and
détruites
millions of
ou
lives
bouleversées.
stolen, destroyed,
Un
or
an que la
turned
Russie
upside
viole de
down.
manière
Today marks
flagrante
1
de
year of
nombreuses
Russia
résolutions de ce
flagrantly
Conseil. C'est par
violating
exemple le
many
cas
resolutions of
de
this
la
Council.
résolution
This is, for
2231
example, the
sur
case of
l'Iran.
Resolution
À ce
2231
titre, nous
on
réitérons aux
Iran.
Nations Unies
Here,
notre
we
demande
reiterate to the
d'enquêter
United
sur les
Nations our
transferts de
call
drones
for an
par Iran
investigation
à
to
la
be
Russie
conducted into
et les
the
livraisons
transfers of
ensuite par la
drones
Corée
by
du
Iran
Nord
to Russia
de missiles
and the
et de
deliveries
munitions.
to this country by North
Un an
Korea
que la
of
Russie manie
missiles
une
and
rhétorique
ammunition.
nucléaire
1 year that Russia
irresponsable de
has
la part d'un État
wielded
doté
nuclear
et met
rhetoric
par
which is
ailleurs en danger la
irresponsible on the
sûreté des
part of a
centrales
nuclear
ukrainiennes
weapons state,
qu'elle
and this
n'hésite pas à
rhetoric
occuper
imperils the
pour
safety
appuyer son agression.
of Ukrainian
Je
power
tiens de ce
plants.
point de vue
Russia
à
does not
saluer les
balk
efforts
at
de l'Agence
occupying these power
internationale de
plants
l'énergie
to support
atomique
its
et
aggression.
de son
Here I
directeur
wish to commend the
général
efforts of
pour
the
assurer
IAEA
la
and its
sûreté
Director
et la
General to
sécurité de la
guarantee
centrale
the
de
safety and
Zaporijia et
security
des autres
of the
centrales
Zaporizhia
nucléaires de
plant and of the
l'Ukraine.
other nuclear power plants in
Un an que de
Ukraine.
nombreux pays
1 year
sont
that
contraints à
many
faire face à une
countries have been
insécurité
forced to
alimentaire
grapple with
croissante
growing food
et à des tensions sur
insecurity
les prix de
and
l'énergie
tensions on
qui sont
energy
la
prices, which
conséquence
are
directe
the
de
direct
la guerre
consequence
russe.
of the Russian war.
Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
nous sommes un an
we
après.
are 1 year
Et les
in.
faits sont là. Il y a un
The facts are
agresseur,
on
la
the table.
Russie,
There
qui
is an
nie ses
aggressor, Russia,
responsabilités.
which is
Et un
denying its
agressé,
responsibilities,
l'Ukraine,
and there is an
qui
aggressee,
se défend mais qui
Ukraine,
parle aussi
which
de
defends
paix
itself but which
et a
also
fait en ce
talks of
sens une
peace, and
proposition
here
respectueuse
has
des
made a
principes de notre
proposal
charte
which
commune
respects the
et
principles
des
of our
valeurs
common
de
charter
notre
and the
organisation,
values of our
qui sont le
organization.
fondement de notre
Values which
sécurité
are the very
collective.
foundation of our collective
C'est cette voie que
security.
l'Assemblée
It is
générale
this path
hier
that
a
yesterday
demandé à
the
nouveau
General
de
Assembly
suivre à
called
une
upon us
très
once again
large
to follow
majorité de
by way of a
141
vast
États,
majority of
comme elle l'avait fait ces
141
derniers
states.
mois en
It
condamnant
did the same in
l'agression
recent
russe
months in
et
condemning the
les
Russian aggression
annexions
and
illégales.
the illegal annexations.
L'Ukraine exerce son droit
Ukraine
à la
is
légitime défense, un
exercising
droit
its
que lui
right to
reconnaît la Charte des
self-defense,
Nations Unies.
a
Voilà
right
pourquoi,
bestowed upon it by the
avec nos
United Nations
partenaires,
Charter. This
nous
is why,
continuerons
alongside
à
our
lui
partners,
apporter
we
le
will
soutien dont
continue
elle a
to
besoin
provide
aussi
Ukraine with the
longtemps qu'il
support
le
it
faudra.
needs for as long as is
Parce qu'il n'y aura
necessary.
nulle
Because
part
there can
de
be
paix et de
peace
stabilité si les
nowhere
agressions sont
or
récompensées.
stability nowhere
Nulle part.
if aggressions are
Monsieur le
rewarded.
Président,
No peace and
un an après,
security
l'agression
anywhere.
russe doit cesser. Les règles
Mr.
du
President,
droit
1 year
international
the Russian aggression must cease. Rules of international law must finally be respected, and Ukraine must recover its sovereignty and territorial integrity. The International Court of Justice made just that appeal on the 16th of March 2022. Consequently, we call upon Russia to finally show itself worthy of the responsibilities conferred upon it as a permanent member of the Security Council and to put an immediate end to its war of aggression against Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Colonna, for her statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. James Cleverly, Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Mr. President, thank you. Mr. Secretary General, thank you also. Today, we mark 1 year since President Putin began his full-scale invasion of Ukraine. 3 months ago, I travelled to Kyiv. Ukraine's Foreign Minister, who is sitting with us here today greeted me, and he had promised to host me for lunch, as representatives of countries often do. But I arrived just after another Russian missile attack on civilian infrastructure had knocked out the water and the electricity supply to that city. But Dmytro, Kyiv, were not going to let Putin's bombs stop him from doing his job. And the restaurant that hosted us rigged up a generator and brought in litres of bottled water, and they provided the lunch. Now, we've all given and received diplomatic hospitality in our job, but that is the kind of diplomatic hospitality that shows something very important. It was a clear demonstration that whilst Ukrainians may have been hit and hit hard, their spirit will not be broken. That restaurant wanted to show me that they would not give up, but they would keep calm and carry on. Dmytro kept his promise to me, and all of us in this chamber today need to keep our promise to Ukraine and keep our promise to the world to protect and defend the UN Charter. Over the past year, Putin has shown that he is willing to wage a war of attrition. And the 20th century's two world wars have shown us what a horror that would be. Hundreds of thousands more dead and wounded. Global shortages of food and fuel. Skyrocketing prices. For these reasons and many more, Putin cannot, must not win in Ukraine. Because what's at stake on the battlefields is the international order itself. And that is at the heart of the United Nations. The UN Charter, territorial integrity, international law. These things exist to protect countries that do not themselves have big and powerful armies. And it is to protect them from the aggression of those countries that do. At the end of the Second World War, the United Nations saw a unique thing in human history. Powerful, victorious nations chose to limit their own power to protect the countries less powerful than themselves. And that is the bottom line. That is why the UN Charter needs to be protected and it needs to be enforced. And it is why 3/4 of the entire membership of the United Nations have repeatedly voted to condemn this invasion in the General Assembly. But President Putin ignores the will of the United Nations. He doesn't care about the UN Charter. On the 24th of February last year, he told us that it was not Russia's plan to occupy Ukrainian territory. On the 8th of December, he called his illegal so-called annexations a significant result for Russia. His land grabs in eastern and southern Ukraine show us that his heart is set on imperial expansion. But 800 Russian soldiers a day are dying for his hopeless ambitions. They are paying for his ego with their lives. As he sees that his aggression against Ukraine is failing, we should expect him to try and strong-arm us into backing down, with every dirty, coercive instrument at his disposal, with cuts to grain and energy shipments, with threats of escalation, with poisonous disinformation, and with cyber attacks. And we must be prepared for this. And we must recognize that these things are a sign of weakness rather than a sign of strength. Those of us in this chamber have a special responsibility to the UN Charter, and we cannot allow Putin's invasion or his threats to succeed. We must not deviate from our resolve. And the UK is proud of the support that we have given Ukraine. But military assistance and humanitarian aid are not enough. Because when this war is over, and it will be over with Ukraine's successful defense of its territory, we must never allow Ukraine again to be left vulnerable to attack. We must make sure that Ukraine is safe and secure and economically viable. And that is why the UK is proud to co-host the Ukraine Recovery Conference in London in June of this year. Together, we must mobilise the combined might of the public and private finance to ensure that Ukraine gets the reconstruction investment that it needs. But what Ukraine wants, what we all want, is for this war to end now, and to end with a victory for Ukraine and a just and enduring peace based upon the UN Charter, because only this can bring an end to the food and fuel shortages that the whole world is suffering from. 1 year on, 1 year into this terrible, terrible war, let us in this chamber send a clear message. Our support for Ukraine is not and will never be time limited. Our defence of the UN Charter is not and will never be time limited. We will keep the promises that we made to the UN Charter and to the Ukrainian people, and we will give the Ukrainians the help that they need for as long as it takes until Ukraine prevails, until its sovereignty and territorial integrity is restored, and until this charter of this organisation is upheld. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Cleverly, for his statement. I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Kwaku Apratum Sarpong, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs and Regional Integration of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. I thank Malta in its capacity as the President of the Security Council for convening this debate on the maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. I also thank the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, for his statement and for his leadership in the past 12 months on the humanitarian, security and political aspects of the war, in support of our shared ambition for an end to the war in Ukraine and a return to the cherished principles of peaceful settlement of disputes. Mr. President, I wish at the outset to reaffirm Ghana's deep commitment to the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We reiterate our solidarity with the people of Ukraine as war ravages their farms, towns, and cities. We will recall, as at the Security Council convened an emergency session on the night of the 24th of February 2022, amid widening concerns of an imminent attack against Ukraine, our worst fears were borne out before our very eyes. Given the firm denials by the Russian Federation to any assertions that the mountain presence of its troops along its shared borders with Ukraine was in preparation for an invasion of Ukraine, Ghana at that time had urged for the de-escalation of tensions and the tampering of war rhetoric. Regrettably, that night, as the Council met, the Russian Federation, without justification, began its actions to violate the sovereignty and territorial integrity of its neighbor Ukraine. As has been asserted so many times, the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine constitutes a serious violation of international law and stands today as one of the clearest violations of the prohibition against the use of force under Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter. Over the past year, As we have called upon the Russian Federation to end this destructive war, we have listened carefully at each turn to its attempt to rationalize the ongoing actions in Ukraine. Between the reality on the ground and the changing narratives, including protection of ethnic Russians in parts of Ukraine from Russophobic attacks, our assessment remains that the ongoing aggression against Ukraine is by all standards unlawful, unjustified, and unacceptable. In our view, conventional frameworks and judicial mechanisms such as the Human Rights Council and the International Court of Justice should serve as the only acceptable recourse in addressing any claims of human rights violations. We therefore consider it untenable that a permanent member of the Security Council entrusted with the distinct responsibility for the promotion and maintenance of international peace and security will choose the path of war to the exclusion of diplomatic and internationally acceptable means at its disposal. The veto by the Russian Federation on the 25th February of the Security Council draft resolution intended to end the military offensive have regrettably prevented the Council from taking decisive action. The present circumstances underscores the long-standing arguments for the urgent reform of the Council and the prohibition of use of the veto, especially in matters affecting international peace and security, more so where a permanent member of the Council is the one in breach of the Charter and international law. The war in Ukraine, as we know, has preceded by efforts to address certain concerns with the post-Cold War European security architecture. We believe that any revisions of the existing structures that guarantee collective security of its members must emerge from broad dialogue involving all relevant actors in the region. We are concerned that the fallout from the continuing war in Ukraine are attempts to create or reinforce opposing alliances, a situation which took us to 2 world wars. We believe that this is the time for cooler heads and the rededication to mutually beneficial cooperation and multilateralism, not competition for hegemonic advantage. Those who wish to dig in their heels for selfish advantage in the geopolitics of the 21st century will lead us down the pit of even greater disaster. Mr. President, the war has unleashed a devastating humanitarian toll and claimed thousands of lives. Sustained missile bombardments mainly targeted at civilian population areas have resulted in more than 21,000 casualties, including 8,006 deaths and 13,287 injured. It is saddening to know that 478 innocent children have been killed and 954 injured. Millions of people have been displaced, with 8 million living as refugees in neighboring countries. Our own national compatriots, most of whom were college students, had their education disrupted and truncated when they were forced to flee from Ukraine. We are informed that about 50% of Ukraine's energy infrastructure has been destroyed or damaged. This situation has left many households without heating or water and at the mercies of the harrowing winter conditions. We regret that hostilities have carried on without regard for the principles of proportionality and distinction, and therefore we reiterate our condemnation for the targeted attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure. Warring parties have obligations under international humanitarian law, which they must comply with. It is important to see the aggression against Ukraine in any light, except as an attack on the accepted standards of our international order, and allowing it to stand impels the independence and equality of states under the Charter, especially of the less powerful states. We must therefore sustain the political will for accountability, first to ensure justice for the people of Ukraine, and not the least for the preservation of the present international order. The coordination of ongoing investigative processes, as well as the strengthening of our international justice system, including the universalization of the Rome Statute, and the International Criminal Court remain crucial to ensuring that the perpetrators of atrocities in Ukraine, like elsewhere, do not go unpunished. We recognize the courageous efforts of the humanitarian workers who have worked under very difficult circumstances to provide life-saving and life-sustaining assistance to some 16 million people, and urge international support to help fund the Ukrainian humanitarian response plan, with the 3.9 billion that is required to aid nearly 40% of the population with varying humanitarian requirements. Mr. President, the rest of the world has not been spared the aftershocks of the war, which continue to reverberate with crippling and systemic impacts on global food, energy, and finance systems. Developing countries have been hard hit by the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. Debt and inflation have little coping capacity for the worsening economic conditions. We take note of the useful policy recommendations put forward by the Global Crisis Response Group on food, energy, and finance to address the vicious cycle of the crisis, including the restructuring of the global debt architecture. We believe priority should be given to implementing those recommendations, especially to support Africa's economic transformation and its capacity to address the growing debt crisis and the interlinked consequences of the war. Given the centrality of Russia Federation and Ukraine in the global grain and fertilizer markets, we support the further renewal of the Black Sea Grain Initiative to ease global market volatilities that hold long economic effects. Necessary attention must also be given to realize the effective implementation of the MOU between the United Nations and the Russian Federation on the export of agro-products and fertilizers. Mr. President, we are acutely concerned by the growing appeal of military logic and the hardening of the conflict to a war of attrition. The war is moving in the direction that leaves much concern, as the events of the past 12 months have demonstrated that no one is immune from the consequences of the war in Ukraine. We have a responsibility to redouble our efforts to avert the catastrophe of a more brutal war that we have been witness to so far. The resolution on a just peace in Ukraine adopted yesterday by the General Assembly under the 11th Emergency Special Session in affirmation of the values and purposes of the Charter of the United Nations should ignite a renewed commitment to take the actions needed to realize our collective aspirations for lasting peace between the two countries. We strongly believe that the channels of diplomacy and dialogue offer the best chances of a just, comprehensive, and a lasting peace, and urge the members of this Council to strengthen their efforts in support of credible negotiations between the two parties. We have little option than to invest in peace. In concluding, Mr. President, we reiterate our call for the Russian Federation to return to the status quo ante through the immediate and unconditional withdrawal of its troops from all areas within the internationally recognized borders of Ukraine. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Apratum Sarpong for his statement, and I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Lana Nuseibeh, Permanent Representative and Assistant Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation for Political Affairs of the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank the Secretary General for his briefing, and I welcome the participation of Ukraine's Foreign Minister today in this meeting. We cannot begin except with an expression of deep sorrow for the lives lost and shattered in the war in Ukraine. We mourn the at least 8,000 civilians killed, and we share in the grief of their loved ones. We are appalled as we mark 1 year of this cruel war, that we do so in the knowledge that it enters its second year. Over the past 2 days, from the podium of the General Assembly, we heard a virtually uninterrupted appeal for peace. A global, diverse, and representative majority issued an unambiguous message. enough. This majority is united by neither allegiance to one side nor hostility to the other. They come together not to preserve geopolitical gain or reverse loss. They are not motivated by petty grievance or grand ambition. They have no interest or ability to wade into great power conflict. In the historical processes and events that forged today's Europe, they were, for the most part, observers, too often unwillingly impacted. Yet, the incontestable fact is that an overwhelming majority of member states are rising to the defense of the UN Charter. It is the Charter that upholds sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. It is the Charter that rejects wars of aggression, conquest, and annexation. It is the Charter that organizes our open and cooperative international order. The question is simple, and it is settled. Those truths, however self-evident, are nonetheless challenged by the war still raging on Ukraine. Military setbacks have been met with military escalation, while the front lines are little changed. The costs, however, have only grown. In Ukrainian lives and livelihoods, in the damage to cities and towns, in the destruction of civilian infrastructure. The war's reach has extended far beyond Ukraine, disrupting food and energy markets, worsening the global debt crisis, and weakening international norms, rules, and laws. Exactly 1 year ago today, the global call for diplomacy and peace went unheeded as the war broke out. Now, we risk its escalation as more battalions mobilize for new offensives. Yesterday, member states renewed their urgent and sincere call for an end to this war. Leaders across the world are responding with mediation efforts and peace plans. Now is the time to invest in inclusive and imaginative diplomacy by truly leveraging this global majority for peace. We must reinforce the Secretary General's offered role as a mediator with consistent, robust, and determined backing. The post-war vision must also incentivize Russia and Ukraine to the negotiating table, not to the battlefield. The war will not end if either side is more threatened by the alternative. Steered by the Charter and history, we can dedicate ourselves towards a peace that is neither vindictive nor callous. We are under no illusions that this effort will be easy. Too much blood has been spilt, too much damage has been done. But all of us should dread with equal certainty what looms in the wake of its failure. Mr. President, Richard Holbrooke once described an effort to end a different war in Europe as something like a combination of chess and mountain climbing. Reaching the summit at which this war ends will require a series of small moves. Renewing the Black Sea Grain Initiative, realizing the MOU on Russian fertilizer and food products, preserving the non-proliferation regime, enhancing humanitarian assistance, continuing prisoner exchanges, and refraining from turning multilateral institutions into a battlefront. To achieve all of that, we must aspire for coordination in our approaches, not conformity. And we must encourage, indeed nurture, all efforts motivated by a genuine desire to peacefully resolve this war. To do that, we must value, not vilify, open lines of communication. That is the path the UAE has chosen. It is the path we have pursued in defense of the UN Charter for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine, preserving its sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Nusaybeh, for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you,
Je
Mr.
remercie le
President.
secrétaire
I wish
général
to
des
thank
Nations
the
Unies
Secretary
d'avoir
General of the United
restitué
Nations for
la
having
portée des principes de la Charte des Nations
reminded
Unies
us of the scope
et
of the
d'avoir
principles of the
dressé le
United
terrible
Nations and for
état des
having
lieux
provided
de la
us
guerre
with
en Ukraine
a
12 mois
horrific
après son
stocktake of the
déclenchement.
war in Ukraine 12 months after
La guerre en
it
Ukraine
was first
a
unleashed. The
un
war
an
in
jour pour jour.
Ukraine is almost exactly
Une
1
année
year old.
entière de
We've
guerre
seen an
meurtrière
entire
qui
year of a
ébranle
bloody war
et
which
met à l'épreuve
undermines
l'ensemble
and
du système
tests
international
the whole of the
et
international
dont
system.
l'onde de choc
Its
impacte
shockwaves
la plupart
are
des
having
nations
an
du monde.
impact on the majority of the
Une année
world's
entière
nations.
où les
This
morts
has been
se
an
comptent en
entire
milliers.
year
Une
in
année
which
de
deaths can be
destruction sans
counted in their
mesure
thousands.
d'infrastructures
This has been a
civiles.
year of
Une année de
unbridled
détresse,
destruction
de
of
peur,
civilian
d'exode,
infrastructure, a year of
où le
distress, of
nombre de
fear, of
réfugiés
exodus,
et de personnes déplacées
a year where
ne
the
cesse
number
de
of
grossir
refugees
au
and
rythme
displaced
des bombardements
persons
et du
continues to
crépitement des
grow
armes.
in line with shelling and
Chaque
under the
jour de
rattle
plus
of gunfire.
dans cette terrible guerre
Every day that
fait
this
craindre le
horrific war
risque d'un
continues increases
débordement
the
et
risk
d'une
of the
mondialisation des
conflict
hostilités.
spilling
Chaque
out of
jour
all
de plus
control
dans la
and
guerre
sees the
fait
risk of a
planer le
globalization of
spectre du risque
hostilities
nucléaire
increase. Every
qui
year
serait
that
sans
every
doute le
day
chemin
rather
de
that this day
non-retour vers
continues
l'irréparable et le chaos.
increases the power of
Cette
the
guerre est
spectre of
insoutenable
risk, that is the
et
risk
doit
of a
s'arrêter
nuclear war, which
immédiatement.
would be without a doubt the path
Dès
of no
l'entame des
return
hostilités,
towards
mon pays a exprimé
irremediable
son
damage and
opposition
chaos.
à la
This
guerre
war is
et
unsustainable
a
and must
condamné la violation
immediately cease.
de
From the
l'intégrité
very
territoriale
onset
de
of
l'Ukraine.
hostilities, my country has expressed its
Le Gabon
opposition
a
to the war
réaffirmé
and
sans
has
équivoque
condemned the
les
violation
principes
of
de
the
la Charte des
territorial
Nations
integrity
Unies
of
en tant que
Ukraine. We have
ciment
reaffirmed
du
in
vivre
unequivocal
ensemble
terms
de la
the
communauté
principles of the
internationale.
United Nations Charter
Par-dessus
as the
tout,
very foundation of our
mon
peaceful
pays
coexistence.
n'a cessé
Above
d'appeler
all,
à
my
un
country has time
cessez-le-feu
and time
immédiat
again called
et
for
à
an
des
immediate
négociations de bonne
ceasefire
foi
and for good
entre les
faith
parties pour
negotiations
faire taire les
between
armes
the
en Ukraine.
parties to silence the guns
Monsieur le
in
Président,
Ukraine. Mr. President,
pendant les 12 mois
over
écoulés,
the last 12 months,
les membres de ce Conseil
the members of
se
this
sont
council
parlé
have
avec force autour de cette table
spoken
sans
out
s'écouter.
in the most forceful
Au cours
terms
des 12
around this
derniers mois,
table over the last 12
chaque
months.
tribune des Nations
Each
Unies,
rostrum of the United
chaque
Nations,
organe a
every
été
body of the
le
United
théâtre
Nations has
d'invectives et
been a
d'antagonismes
theatre for
qui
the
n'ont
exchange
été
of
d'aucun secours
insults
ni
and
recours
antagonistic
pour ceux qui
rhetoric,
tombent dans les
which are of
tranchées
no aid or
ou qui sont
assistance for
écrasés
those
sous les
falling in the
décombres
trenches or for
dans
those
les champs
crushed
de
under
bataille,
the rubble
dans
and
les
on the
villes et
battlefields,
dans les villages.
those that have fallen in cities
Il est
and
temps de
villages.
faire
It is
halte devant
time
le torrent
to
de sang
stem the blood
et le
flow
flot de
and
détresse
the
humaine
rivers of
qui
human suffering
interpellent
which
nos consciences.
call us to
Il est
action
temps
and
de
pique our conscience. It
mobiliser,
is time
de
to
nous mobiliser
mobilize.
pour
It is
mettre
time for
fin
us to
à la
mobilize
guerre
to
en
put an
Ukraine.
end to the war in Ukraine.
En tant que membre du
As
Conseil de
members of the
sécurité,
Security Council,
nous devons une
we
réaction à tous les meurtris
a
de la guerre.
response to all
Nous devons une
those
réponse aux
killed
innombrables
and
victimes
injured in the war.
qui se
We owe a
demandent à quand
response to the
cessera la guerre.
countless victims that are asking
Nous devons
themselves
une
when the war
réponse
will
aux
end.
réfugiés
We
sans
owe a
nombre
response to
qui
the
se demandent
countless
quand ils
refugees
pourront
that are
rentrer
asking
chez eux.
when they can
Nous
return
devons
home.
sans délai nous
We
réconcilier
must,
avec
without
l'esprit de la
delay,
Charte des Nations
bring
Unies
our action in
qui
line with the
s'énonce en
spirit of the
termes
United Nations
d'épargner à
Charter,
cette génération
which
le
promises
fléau de
to
la guerre.
spare this
Mon
generation
pays
from the scourge
réitère
of
son
war.
appel
My country
aux
reiterates
partis
its
pour des
appeal to
négociations de bonne
parties
foi
to
en
engage
vue de
in
mettre
good faith
fin à cette
negotiations
guerre.
in order to put an end to this
L'espoir
war.
suscité
The
par
hope
l'accord de la
sparked
mer
by
Noire sur
the
les
Black Sea
céréales
Grain
doit
Initiative
être
must be
ravivé,
revived,
non seulement pour
not
le
only
renouvellement
in
du
order
dit
to
accord,
guarantee the
mais
renewal of
pour
that agreement,
dresser les
but
passerelles d'un
also
dialogue
to
franc à même
build
de
a
parvenir
bridge for
à la
candid
cessation des
dialogue, which
hostilités.
will ultimately lead to a
Nous appelons
cessation
les
of
parties
hostilities.
à la
We
retenue
call
et à la
upon parties
responsabilité.
to exercise
À
restraint
la
and
responsabilité devant l'histoire qui
responsibility.
sera
They must
toujours
be
plus
accountable
grande que la vaine
before
gloire des
history.
hégémonies sans vertu
History
ni
which will
lendemain.
always be bigger than the
Je redis l'opposition
illusion
de mon pays
of
à la guerre
immediate gains and the glory
à la
of
guerre en
imposing
Ukraine
hegemonies
et à
which
toute
have
guerre
no
dans le
promise
monde,
or
notamment
tomorrow.
à celles
I
si nombreuses,
once
si
again
chroniques et si
express
cycliques en
my
Afrique.
country's opposition to
Rejeter
this
le
war, to the
logiciel de
war
la
in
guerre
Ukraine, and opposition
n'est
to all
ni
wars
une
in
forme
the
de
world,
fuite,
namely those
ni
that
de
are
lâcheté, encore
so
moins une
numerous, so
posture
chronic and
opportuniste.
cyclical
Ce
as those in
n'est
Africa.
surtout pas une rhétorique
Rejecting the
d'impuissance
logic
ou
of war
d'indifférence.
is not a form of
C'est
neutrality,
plutôt
cowardice, or an
retenir les
opportunistic
leçons
stance.
indélébiles de
It's not the
l'histoire
expression of
des guerres
powerlessness or
injustes
indifference,
qui nous
rather it is
martèlent
a way
que ceux qui
of
causent,
learning
ceux qui
the
entretiennent
indelible
ou
lessons
qui
of history,
déclenchent
the lessons
les
that have
guerres
taught us time
en
and
sont
time
rarement les
again,
vainqueurs.
that those that cause, maintain, or trigger wars are
S'extraire
rarely
du
the winners
logiciel de la
of
guerre,
them.
dont les options
Taking
offertes sont
a
si
step back
étroites
from
et
the
si
logic
indigentes
of war,
dans
whose
les
options are
belligérances
often
impliquant les
so
puissances,
narrow,
c'est demeurer en
is
phase
to
avec les idéaux qui
remain
sédimentent et
in
font la
step
noblesse
with the
de l'Organisation des
ideals
Nations Unies.
that form the very foundations of
Parce
the
que la
United
guerre
Nations
est
nobility.
contraire aux valeurs qui fondent
Because
cette
war runs
Organisation des
counter
Nations
to the
Unies
values
et ce
which
Conseil de sécurité.
founded this United Nations
Chaque jour de
organization
guerre
and this Security
met
Council. Every day
en question notre
of
vocation,
war
notre
calls into
mandat et
question
notre
our
crédibilité.
vocation, our mandate, and our
Pour terminer,
credibility. To
je voudrais
conclude, I wish
redire
to state once again
notre appel pour la paix en
that
Ukraine.
we appeal for
Parce
peace
que nous
in
sommes pour
Ukraine,
la paix,
because we are for
nous
peace.
soutiendrons chaque fois
And
les efforts
because of
vers
that,
le
we will
dialogue
always support
et nous
efforts for
soutiendrons
dialogue,
chaque initiative
and we
qui
will
s'inscrit
support every
dans
initiative
l'activation des
designed
canaux
to
de la
open the
diplomatie
channels of
en vue
diplomacy
de faire taire
in
les
order
armes
to
en Ukraine.
silence
Je vous
the
remercie.
guns in Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Gabon for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель,
Mr. President,
сегодня завершается
today is the
непростая
last
для
day
недели,
of
которая
a week which was anything but
запомнится
simple,
всем
and it will be
информационной
remembered by one and all
шумихой и
for
суетой,
the information
устроенной
hullabaloo
Украиной
which
и ее
was
западными
created by Ukraine,
спонсорами
its Western
по
sponsors,
поводу годовщины начала
related
России
to
специальной
the
военной операции
one-year
в Украине.
mark of the Russian special military operation in
Именно, судя
Ukraine.
по всему,
And
к
it would
этому
seem that
свелся обещанный
this is
присутствующим сегодня здесь
what
господином Кулебой еще в
was
январе саммит
what the
мира на
promise
Нью-Йоркской
boils down to,
площади.
the promise made by Mr. Kuleba in January to have
Для
a peace
анализа
summit in
сказанного за
New
эту
York.
неделю нашими
So as
бывшими
to
западными
analyze what was said
партнерами
by
можно
our
было
former
бы без
Western
преувеличения
partners during this
созвать
week,
целую
we could,
политологическую
without
конференцию.
exaggeration, convene a whole
Возможно,
political
так впоследствии
science
произойдет.
conference, and
Даже
possibly
в
that this will
исторической
happen in the future. Well,
ретроспективе.
people will want to cast a
Мы
retrospective
предложили бы для
eye
нее
on
такое
this.
название.
And for such a
Еще
political
один
science
упущенный
conference, we
шанс
could
для мирного
propose the
решения
following
украинской
title:
кризиса.
Yet another missed opportunity to peacefully
Это было
resolve
бы
the
правильным,
Ukrainian
потому
crisis.
что под
And
любыми
this would be
выражениями
right,
со
because
словом «мир», которые
any
лукаво
expression using
употребляли,
the
в
word
том числе и
peace, which are
сегодня,
being disingenuously used,
высокопоставленные
including today
представители
by
Украины и
high
западных
representatives
стран,
of Ukraine and Western
на самом
countries,
деле
what is
подразумевает
meant is
совсем
actually
другое.
something completely different.
А именно,
What is meant
капитуляция
is a
России,
capitulation
нанесение
of Russia
стратегического
and
поражения.
inflicting a
В
strategic
идеале
defeat
с
on Russia,
последующим распадом
ideally
перекройки
followed by the
входящих на территорию.
disintegration of the country and redrawing the territories it
Эти истинные цели
includes.
западного
These
вмешательства
true
в
goals
украинские
of
дела,
Western interference in
наиболее
Ukrainian
наглядно
affairs
проявившиеся,
were
кстати сказать,
clearly
почти ровно 9
displayed,
лет
by the way,
назад, в
almost
день
exactly
Майданного
9 years ago on the day of the
антиконституционного
Maidan
переворота
anti-constitutional
21
coup
февраля
on the 21st of
2014
February
года
2014.
не скрывались с самого начала.
And people didn't hide them from the very
И
beginning.
именно они привели
And
к формированию
these
на наших
are
границах
exactly the goals
враждебного
which resulted in the
националистического
fact that on our borders we have a hostile nationalistic Russophobic regime which decided that they would resolve the Ukrainian issue with zeal. Our British colleague yesterday, when she spoke in the General Assembly and she criticized the Belarus submitted amendments to the draft resolution, she stated then that the amendments equate the aggressor and the victim. Are you not at all concerned by the fact that your victim is up to its elbows in blood and Nazi tattoos, and the 9-year-old period of elimination of Russian-speaking citizens in Donbass? Do you think it's normal? Why do you think it's normal for Ukraine to send guns and tanks against unarmed civilians in the east and bomb them only because those people do not want to give up on their own identity? Because that is exactly what the Kiev regime did in the summer of 2014, and it was then the internal Ukrainian armed conflict erupted. Do you think that we were supposed to resign ourselves to this situation? Please allow me to remind you that its aggression against Yugoslavia was justified by NATO by the campaign of terror and the need for the Kosovars to live in security and enjoy universal human rights and freedoms on an equal basis. This is a quote from the statement made by NATO on the 23rd of April, 1999.
Получается, что вы и другие ваши коллеги отказываете русскоязычным украинцам в универсальных правах и свободах, если представляете напавшую на них киевскую власть жертву, и умалчиваете про кампанию террора, которая была против них